So hello everyone and welcome to part 3 of what I hope will be a long and substantial series on the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. As I've said before, I think it's a book that's far more important than the credit and attention that it gets. It merits far more credit and attention than it gets, and the purpose of this series is to dig more deeply into the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance than I think, as far as I know, anyone else has done, certainly more than anyone else has done here on YouTube, at least as far as I'm aware. Whether you're listening to this right now live or whether you're listening to it in the future, I hope you're doing well and I hope you enjoy the series. Also, if you happen to find this video and it's your introduction to the channel Good and Basic, then I hope you'll check out some of our other videos and find something that you enjoy and appreciate there, that you'll find something that is, to coin a phrase, that is high quality. So last time what we talked about mostly is this idea that Pirsig has that maybe attitude matters, and maybe that that it's not just an idea for pop psychologists, that it's not just an idea for motivational speakers, but that it actually has some let's say hard and fast scientific or empirical or technological value, which is a pretty interesting idea because normally when we think about technology we do not think about attitudes. We don't think about attitudes at all. And Pirsig thinks we should, and I hope that I can do a good job of representing why I think Pirsig is correct in thinking we should. So today's subject is similar to that in that, when you talk about positive psychology, there's this tendency to sort of think of positive psychology as sort of, a pop psychology thing, something for motivational speakers, something for self-help gurus, something that is associated broadly with what you might call woo. And sometimes I see it called woo, W-O-O, and what that means is sort of this conglomeration of like pseudo-scientific, pseudo-rational, quasi-spiritual and psychological beliefs. And that manifests itself in a whole host of ways that I don't want to mention because I don't want to get too in the weeds about it. But I think everyone knows what I mean by woo when I talk about woo. So this is a continual, I don't know if it's a problem, but it's a challenge that Pirsig runs into again and again because he's trying to pry a crowbar into science and technology and rationality and crack it open and allow space for something more. And the risk of doing that is that it makes you look like you're one of these self-help gurus, motivational speakers, that you're a doctor of woo. And Pirsig is not a doctor of woo. And it's not what he is. It's not what he's trying to do. And he works very hard to not be that way. But it's something that you can think as you look at his writings. It's a potential way that he can be misinterpreted. So a lot of what I'm hoping to do here and now today is to defend him from the charge of woo. And that will be particularly interesting today because he's going to make some very interesting claims and some claims that are very strange. And that particularly if you're a hard-headed scientific person, at first kind of sound like they are definitely inside the realm of woo. They sound a little bit wacko. And I'll confess that although Pirsig's background in the hard sciences is, I would say, pretty solid, my background in the hard sciences is not particularly solid. I got through a relatively low-level college chemistry class, I think with an A-, and that was about everything I could do. That was about as much as I could do as far as the hard sciences. So I'm happy to, when it comes to technical knowledge in the hard sciences, I'm happy to admit my own shortcomings. However, and so if you do happen to have a background in the hard sciences, then I'd be very interested in your perspective on these things, both in the live chat and in the comments if you happen to be listening to this later. Okay, so we're in chapter 3, and this idea that Pirsig is advancing, this idea that Pirsig is discussing, is something about whether or not the laws of science are really real, and if they are real, what it means for them to be real. And what that ends up looking like is a conversation something like this. They start talking about ghosts and whether or not ghosts are real, and they start talking about ghost stories. And what Pirsig says inside of the dialogue is... Just one moment. He says, modern man has his ghosts and spirits too, The laws of physics and of logic, the number system, the principle of algebraic substitution, these are ghosts. We just believe in them so thoroughly that they seem real. And he says, for example, it seems completely natural to presume that gravitation and the law of gravitation existed before Isaac Newton. It would sound nutty to think that until the 17th century, there was no gravity. And then he asks, so he goes through this discussion, and he says, if you think that the law of gravity existed before Isaac Newton, then you have to believe that this law of gravity existed before the beginning of the Earth, before the sun and the stars, before the primal generation of anything, before the Big Bang. This law of gravity existed. And this law of gravity has no mass of its own and no energy of its own. And it's not in anyone's mind because there are no minds, because this is pre-Big Bang. And there's no space because it's pre-Big Bang. So there's not anywhere and there's not anything, mind or matter, and this law of gravity still exists. And that's his challenge. And he says, if that law of gravity existed, I honestly don't know what a thing has to do to be non-existent. It seems to me that that law of gravity has passed every test of non-existence there is. You can't think of a single attribute of non-existence that the law of gravity didn't have, or a single attribute of existence it did have. And yet it's still common sense to believe it existed. And so I think for anyone, right, like if somebody comes up to you and tries to convince you that the law of gravity doesn't exist in some sense, then that's kind of a counterintuitive idea. And if you are somebody who is very invested in the hard sciences, then this is going to sound potentially just completely crazy. And so what I want to do is kind of explain what I think he means by this and why it's far from crazy, in fact, and why, in fact, it's the most rigorously scientific attitude to have about things like the law of gravity. So let's see. I'm thinking about exactly how I want to tackle this. So, okay, yeah. So let's talk about the law of gravity. And by the way, contextually, when we talk about this, we're raising a subject called the mind-matter problem, which is a very old problem in philosophy. And the mind-matter problem, or the mind-body problem, basically goes like this. It's a metaphysical problem. Metaphysics is all about, the nature of being. It's about the nature of existence. It's about what kinds of things exist. And so the mind-body problem goes something like this. If you look around yourself and you walk around in the world and you experience things, you'll notice that there are lots of things that exhibit physical properties. For instance, I can walk across the bridge and the bridge is solid. I don't fall through it. I'll eat food and it has a certain taste. And if I drive kind of crazy in a car, then I start to induce car sickness in myself. I start to induce a sense of vertigo. That's another physical characteristic that I can elicit from the world around me. There's also quite a few things that don't seem to have the same sort of physical quality. For example, emotions. It's debatable whether or not those have a physical quality. It doesn't seem like you can precisely touch anger. You feel it in your body, but it's certainly not accessible to everybody else in the same way that, if I have a certain object, I can describe its physical properties and hand it to someone else, and they'll presumably describe those same physical properties. It's not particularly easy to see how, I could hand my anger to somebody else and let them feel my anger. And ideas are the same way. I have an idea in my head, but it's not quite clear sort of what the physical property of that idea is. And so this is fundamentally the mind-body problem, is the idea that some things in the world, well, it's the precursor to the mind-body problem, I should say. It's mind-body dualism, that there are some things in this universe that are physical matter, and that this physical matter, things like atoms and electrons and chemicals and physical objects, they're the same for everybody. It's this objective world it's real even if you close your eyes. It's real even if you don't believe in it. It's just sort of there. And then there's this other world of mind, of mental phenomena, of psychological phenomena, let's say. And this world is subjective. It's something that is internal to oneself. It's something that one personally has and experiences, and that other people don't have the ability to experience. So in this realm go, perhaps your opinions, and many people would say there's a big discussion about whether or not morality fits in there. You've probably had an argument or discussion at some point in your life about whether or not morality is real. Or whether it's not, it's objective, which we usually think of as more or less the same question. And if it is objective, then, well, there should be one morality that everyone can agree upon. And the counter position is that, well, morals are not real in that sense. They're not objective. Instead, they're something that's subjective. It's something where everybody has their own. But there's no sort of like universally accessible phenomena of morals that we can all appeal to and all agree on and all say, yes, this is definitely real. In the same way that we all think that the moon is real, or that we all think that atoms are real, and we all think that chemistry is real. So these two different things, mind and body. And the mind-body problem is, okay, well, that seems just a little bit strange. We have two different things, and it's not clear how they connect, and it's not clear how they affect each other. And it's not even clear sort of what the common foundation of these are. And so it seems kind of strange to look at the world and say, okay, so like the whole universe are just made of these two different things, minds and bodies. And, philosophers for hundreds of years have thought about this, and, well, they've thought lots of different things that I'm not going to sum up now. But I hope you can see that it's kind of an interesting question, whether you're talking about things like beauty, or things like morality, or things like truth, or things like the physical nature of the universe. That there's this ongoing conversation and discussion that you can have about whether or not those are things that exist in your mind or things that exist in the external physical world. And consequently, whether they're things that are subjective and therefore, primarily dependent upon individual opinion versus objective, things that are true, whether or not you believe in them, roughly speaking. And so here's what Pirsig is saying here is, okay, so what is the law of gravity? Let's kind of plug his ideas about the law of gravity into the mind-body problem. What is the law of gravity? So one thing you might think is, okay, well, is gravity is it a physical phenomena? Is it part of this objective material world that surrounds us, that's accessible to everybody through the senses, that's accessible through scientific empirical measurement? And on the one hand, you want to say, well, yes, of course. I mean, that's 9.82 meters per second squared, right? We experimentally verify the rate at which gravity accelerates bodies and blah, blah, blah. And so therefore, we know that this is real. It's part of the objective world. And Pirsig wants to push on that a little bit, right? So let's push on that a little bit, and let's say, okay, well, let's talk about this law of gravity. What exactly is this law of gravity? Because let's just take the Earth and the Sun as an example. I can look at the Earth and I can say, well, yes, that's empirically verifiable matter, right? That is definitely part of the physical objective universe. And I can also look at the Sun and say, well, that is also physical matter. It's directly part of the empirical observable universe, right? And I can also observe that the Earth goes around the Sun. But here's the question is, what part of all of this is the law of gravity, right? Is it the Earth? Because that doesn't make any sense because it's more general than the Earth. And is it the Sun? Well, it's not that because it's more general than the law of the Sun. Or it's more general than the Sun. It's something, the law of gravity is something like a relationship, not only between the Earth and the Sun, but a relationship between all kinds of physical matter. Okay, well, if that, it's very nice to call it a relationship, but again, the core question is, okay, well, if it's part of the physical observable universe, then presumably it has to be made of either energy or matter, right? And I don't know enough about theoretical physics to start talking about dark matter or dark energy, so we're just going to leave those aside for now. So, okay, well, the law of gravity has to be made of energy or matter, and if you start squinting at it, the conclusion that you'll probably come to is, well, no, the law of gravity isn't made of energy or matter. It seems to generate force. It generates energy, right? If I drop an anvil, then it's, gathers quite a bit of force and momentum and can be quite dangerous. There's also quite a lot of, the law of gravity acts on mass, right? And we see that, just when things fall towards the Earth. And we also see that, for example, in the orbits of the planets, right? So it definitely acts on matter, and it definitely has this sort of energetic component, but it's not really clear that the law of gravity is made of matter or energy. And so then you say, okay, well, if it's not made of matter and it's not made of energy, then it can't be part of the physical observable universe. And if it can't be part of the physical observable universe, then it has to be something else. And the only other category is for it to be a mental subjective phenomena. And then if you think it's a mental subjective phenomena, then you start squinting at things and you're like, oh, okay, well, so did it exist before Isaac Newton? Because it's not in Isaac Newton's mind because Isaac Newton isn't alive, right? And you have to say, well, no, it's definitely not in Isaac Newton's mind because he's not there, right? And then you think, okay, well, could it have existed in the mind of somebody before Isaac Newton? And if you think about that, eventually you'll come to the conclusion, well, no, because they didn't think of it, right? So it can't have been in their mind. So we've already decided it can't be in Newton's mind. It can't be in anyone else's mind, at least before Newton, right? And it's also not in the physical universe. It's not in the matter. It's not made of matter. It's not made of energy. And so what you actually turn out with is that the law of gravity doesn't have a single attribute of existence. according to, basic theories of mind-body dualism, because it can't be a mental phenomena if it existed from time immemorial, and it can't be a physical phenomena because it doesn't have mass or energy. Okay, so having said that, let's back up just a second, because again, if somebody comes to you and says the law of gravity isn't real, then you ought to have a nice long conversation with them and figure out what they're saying so that you know that they're not crazy. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. Maybe you could take up the position, let's take up a pro-gravity position, and let's say, we want to defend the idea that gravity is real, and you say, okay, well, maybe the law of gravity didn't exist before Isaac Newton, right? Like the specific sort of sentence, right? Gravity accelerates things at 9.82 meters per second squared, right? Maybe that didn't exist, right? And that seems to make some sense, right? Because you can't have 9.82 meters per second squared until you have meters, right? And of course, it's different in imperial measurements in the United States and so on and so forth. And you say, okay, well, I understand the description maybe didn't exist before Isaac Newton, right? But the underlying phenomena definitely did exist before Isaac Newton. Like before Isaac Newton, things still, you hold a bowling ball and it drops and it still drops. Things still fall and the planets are still in their orbit. So whether you can call it the law of gravitation or you can call it something else, and you can measure it in meters or you can measure it in feet. You can measure it any way you want. But the point is that there's still this underlying phenomena, and that is definitely real. And, at first blush, I think that looks like a very persuasive argument, and it looks like Pirsig's lost the fight, but I don't think Pirsig has lost the fight, and here's why. That argument rests on the idea, it consists of the idea, really, that gravity is this underlying phenomena, right? So we can describe it in different ways. You can describe it the way Newton described it. You can describe it in a variety of different ways, in feet or meters or however you prefer. But underlying it is the exact same phenomena. And I think if you push at that idea, you actually find that it's not really correct. So, for example, and the way that you can tell that it's not correct is because you just have to ask the question, okay, well, what is that underlying phenomena precisely? You're telling me that same underlying phenomena has existed, after Isaac Newton, before the creation of the Earth, all the way back to the Big Bang, maybe even before the Big Bang, right? So if you're going to tell me that phenomena existed all that time, then what is that phenomena exactly? Tell me what it is. And if pressured, you might say something like, okay, well, it's this idea that things fall towards the Earth, right? And that's sort of I would say, like a pre-Newtonian conception of what gravity is. And it actually turns out that that's the wrong conception of what gravity is. It's the wrong conception. What's believed right now by scientists, if I understand correctly, let's even not go there yet. Let's go back to the time of Isaac Newton. So Isaac Newton, if I am understanding the history correctly, and I apologize if I'm not, and if it's not him, it's another contemporary scientist, right, who says, well, it's not just the objects fall towards the Earth. It's that all matter attracts matter, right? So it's not just objects falling towards the Earth. The Earth is actually, very slightly falling towards that object, right? And not only that, but the Earth is actually sort of falling towards the sun, right? Continually. And also, this is the idea underlying like the International Space Station and rockets and satellites that we send into orbit, right? Is that we're going to get it up high enough and it's just going to continually fall around the Earth. And it's always going to be in free fall. It's always going to be attracted towards the Earth. But it's going to fall in such a way that it continually falls rather than ever, eventually coming to land on Earth's surface. Right? So notice we have this pre-Newtonian notion of gravity, which is things fall towards the Earth. And then we have this sort of Newtonian or post-Newtonian way of thinking about it, thinking about gravity, which is, well, it's actually all matter attracting matter, right? And this applies, it's not just things falling towards the Earth can fall towards things too. And that this is actually the way that, planets go around the sun and the way orbits work and so on and so forth, right? Okay, well, observe though that this is not the same phenomena, right? These are two different phenomena. This pre-Newtonian phenomena of things falling towards the Earth and this post-Newtonian phenomena of everything falling towards everything, those are different ideas, right? They're actually different phenomena. And so which phenomena precisely existed from the beginning of time all the way up until now? And this isn't all, right? It actually gets even more complicated because if I understand correctly, the contemporary sort of Einsteinian notion of gravity is not that matter attracts matter, but instead that the way you should think about gravity is that it's sort of a divot in space-time. It's like a, if you put a bowling ball in a blanket or on a trampoline, then that trampoline or that blanket will create this depression. And it's that depression, this sort of distortion in space-time, that actually creates what we think of as gravity. Okay, well, now we have that's actually quite a bit different. That is a different conception than the idea that matter attracts matter, or the idea that gravity is just things falling towards the Earth. And so these are actually different phenomena. Okay, so it's not the same underlying phenomena. Okay, well, let's take another, let's try to advance this sort of pro-gravity as real position for a little while longer. Because another thing you could say in response to this is, okay, well, fair enough, right? Like, I understand that we've gotten better and better and more correct descriptions of what gravity is. But it's still the same underlying phenomenon. It's the same thing happening. We're just learning to describe it in more sophisticated ways. To which my response is, okay, and I think this is also Pirsig's response, is, okay, well, that's fair enough, right? You can posit, you could make this claim that there is the same underlying phenomena. But that's not actually what we see. What we see is that the phenomena changes, right? And we see that it acquires new properties over time as we describe it in more sophisticated ways. And so perhaps you want to assert that, well, there really is this same underlying phenomena. But here's the problem, is you can't say anything about that phenomena, because whatever you say about it is some description that's going to be obsolete 50 years from now. And so you can say that there's an underlying phenomena, but you can't say anything about it. You can't describe it in any kind of final or complete way. And so really, to assert that gravity is, to assert that there is an underlying phenomena there, is something of an act of faith. What we have across the history of scientific endeavor is a series of descriptions, and these descriptions adjust and they change, and we sort of recompartmentalize things as well. We move concepts from sort of one box of ideas to another box of ideas. These ideas change over time, and you can to say that there is a single underlying, fundamentally indescribable and unknowable phenomena underneath it. If that's scientific, then we have to bend what science means quite a bit. And I think we'll actually find that Pirsig is very comfortable bending the limits of science. Like I said, he's trying to kind of stick a crowbar into science and crack it open and open it up and allow it to have a little bit more space. But I hope that at very least you're starting to think, well, wait a second. Is gravity real? Or is gravity sort of the name and the description and the sort of accumulated scientific observations that we have surrounding this, some underlying phenomena, and we have no idea really what that phenomena is in any kind of final or complete way? We just have these sort of approximate theories that are the best way we have to understand it up until the present. And this isn't just true for gravity, by the way. I actually think a much clearer example is the atom. Right? So, atoms are real, obviously, right? There's no scientist that will tell you that atoms are not real. They're empirically verifiable, right? I mean, we split one and made a bomb, right? What more could you want? They're definitely real. And you can use the same kind of logic that I've been using and that I've been sort of adapting from Pirsig to start poking at that idea too. And you actually find out that sort of corrosive analysis that I've been doing is the same thing that scientists have been doing, literally for thousands of years about atoms. So the way you start with the atom is you go back to, it comes from a Greek word that means indivisible. So the Greek idea of an atom is, well, what an atom is it's this little particle, and it's the smallest particle that you could possibly have. There's just not a smaller particle. And we can't see it and we don't know what it is, but whatever it is, let's just call it an atom and we're done. Right? And as you move through the, I think the 19th and 20th and now the 21st centuries, what happens is our models and descriptions of what atoms are end up changing pretty drastically over time. They end up changing pretty dramatically, right? So, and I looked at the Wikipedia page and there's like 12 different models and I can't remember all of them, but you'll probably remember a few of these from middle school and high school and college chemistry or whatnot, right? So, there's this idea that, well, so the Greeks were wrong. It's not a single indivisible particle. It's actually made up of smaller particles. There's protons and neutrons and electrons, and these electrons are sort of, this is the plum pudding model, is they're sort of distributed through it like plums in a pudding, right? And so it's this sort of semi-homogeneous substance with electrons distributed through it, right? And then you have a later theory, which is sort of the planetary model of the atom. And this is kind of the one that I grew up learning, and then it got superseded by other stuff. But the planetary model is this idea that you have a nucleus, right, of protons and neutrons, and then the electrons are sort of circling that nucleus in the same way that like planets orbit the sun, so it's like a solar system, and so it's this orbit planetary sort of model of the atom, and isn't that cool? Right, and you'll see this frequently, like in different agencies that have something to do with atoms, atomic research agencies and whatnot. You'll see like a dot or a kind of a glob in the middle, and then there will be these rings around it. And those rings are sort of the planetary orbits, and that's the way that we started thinking about atoms. But it turns out that that's actually not quite right. Instead, we started thinking about those orbits in terms of shells. Right, so it's not so much an orbit where the electron is flying around. Instead, it's more like there's a series of concentric shells, and then it gets even more complicated because maybe it's not just that there are a series of concentric shells. Maybe it's not even the way we should think about it. Isn't that the electrons are flying around the nucleus in orbit? Instead, it's that those shells are probability distributions. And so the way we're measuring these electrons is we're saying, okay, there's a given probability that the electron will be here at a given point in time, right? And I might even be a little behind the times. Maybe in the last 10 years, I don't know what they're teaching in high schools these days. Maybe there's a new model of the atom. So my point is, right, that you have the same thing going on that you have with the law of gravity, right? Is what an atom is changing. At least our understanding of it is changing. And if you want to say, well, our understanding of it is changing, but the underlying phenomena is exactly the same, my answer is, well, no, it's not. Because for the Greeks, as far as they were concerned, the underlying phenomena was an indivisible particle. We don't believe that at all anymore. In fact, we know that that's not true because this is the way that, nuclear bombs and nuclear power plants work, is we actually can split atoms, and you can see what happens when you split atoms, so it really does look like we're doing it. And so, if you want to assert that the underlying phenomenon is the same, it's like, okay, well, you can do that, but only on the condition that you give up any sort of final ability to define what that underlying phenomena is. And, if you are going to say what the universe is it's this, what the scientific perspective on life is that there's this underlying phenomena that's everywhere, and it's pervasive, and it's immutable throughout time, and it affects everything, but it's also, finally indescribable, and we can kind of have approximations of it. We can kind of generalize about what its nature is and so forth, but we can never finally know or describe what it is. You need to go look the medieval theologians up, because that's what they said about God. And I don't necessarily have any objection to that view of science, and Pirsig doesn't either, as far as I can tell. And I think it's actually, substantially more correct than many views of science you could have. Right? But the point is that this is a very strange and spooky way of thinking about science, and it's all the more strange and spooky because I think if you chase down Pirsig's logic, you'll find that it's substantially correct. You'll find that it's substantially correct to say that laws of science, like gravity and like the atom, are not permanent enduring phenomena, and that presumably, although there is some sort of permanent enduring phenomena underneath it, that we can't know anything finally about it in any kind of scientific way, and that to assert that it is there is something like an act of faith, since we can't empirically verify it. And you know that we can't empirically verify it because our measurements of it and our observations of it and our models of it keep changing. So even if you do think that there is something underneath that, which I think is probably the common sense view that we will all take, right? That like there's something real underneath all of this. Even if you take that position, you're deprived of the kind of knowledge about it that many people presume science can give. You're deprived of the kind of like final, complete, absolute, perfect, exact, unchanging knowledge that hypothetically science is supposed to grant. And all of this is, it's spooky. It's a spooky way of thinking about this. I want to comment, by the way, that if anyone is commenting in chat, for some reason I'm totally unable to see it. So I hope I haven't missed anything that anyone has said. I mentioned that also because I think this is probably a logical break to talk about the second portion of things. Although if anyone has any questions about this sort of scientific model, that I'd definitely like to answer those questions right now or tackle them. Because again, it's kind of a weird way to think, and I think that if you chase it down, you'll find that it has quite a bit of merit to it. But you have to kind of chase it down, and you have to kind of shake off sort of the conventional habits of thought that you have about science. So, there's that. And okay, yeah, so Kevin Kenny is mentioning it's central to science. I'd love to hear, sort of what you have to say about that, or what you mean by that, because I think that's absolutely correct. And that's the position that Pirsig is ultimately going to take, is that this isn't an anti-science position. It's actually the most pro-science position you can take, because it's to correctly recognize the process that takes place at the heart of science. And we'll actually be talking about this in coming chapters when we talk about the scientific method, when we talk about Poincaré, when we talk about how Pirsig was ultimately expelled from the university. Yes, and okay, so Kevin is bringing up the point that every scientific hypothesis is falsifiable. Any hypothesis can be toppled by new evidence. Correct. And so what Pirsig is asking us to do is to kind of take that idea to its logical extension, I think, and to say, okay, well, all the scientific truth that you know, and we don't even have to stop there. We can go on and say all the mental models you have, right? All the sort of approximations and descriptions that you have that help you model whatever it is that's surrounding us, right? Like presumably there's something out there, right? Because, you interact with it and it does things and you do things to it, right? But whatever's out there, all the mental models that we're using to approximate and describe and sort of interact with it, that we're using to mediate our experience, all of those things are real with a very large asterisk next to them. They're real with a very large asterisk. And even the most fundamental verities, like gravity, still have a very substantial asterisk next to them. And above all, right, because at first this starts sounding, you might get to the point where you think, okay, well, Pirsig's right, because he's just saying that, over time we are able to test we're able to test scientific propositions in new and more sophisticated ways, and we, our knowledge of science develops. And Pirsig is even, I think, going one step beyond that and saying, what you need to understand is that all of this stuff that we call science, and really all human knowledge, is always removed. It's once removed from whatever reality actually is. And whatever reality actually is fundamentally indescribable. And I guess, what does that mean, fundamentally indescribable? Because you can describe it, right? But those descriptions, let's say, aren't adequate to capture it. They're not equal to the real thing. They're not a substitute for the real thing. That real thing, whatever it is underneath it, always reserves the right to poke back at these models, no matter how solid you think those models are. And those models include things like gravity, right? So you might think the models are just, the models are sort of more recent and more apparently flexible ideas in science. But Pirsig is going to say, no, this goes all the way down to our most basic scientific verities. It goes all the way down straight to things like gravity that are just so common sense that you would never, ever, ever think to question them. Okay. Yeah, okay. I think that's probably enough. Yeah, I Kevin Kenny, this quote from George Box, all models are wrong, some models are useful. I don't think Pirsig could possibly agree with that more, to be honest. I also want to comment, as we're sort of wrapping up this ghost section, that I think as you read this section, it's fair to take what Pirsig says here with a grain of salt and to critically examine it. And I mean, that's always a fair thing to do with whoever you're reading, but I think it's especially true to, it's especially good advice when you read this particular section. There's actually some textual evidence for that. One of the things he mentions is that the whiskey, the fatigue, and the wind and the trees start mixing in his mind. So there's this idea that maybe the author doesn't want us to take at 100% face value the things that are being said here. And then, in this sort of narration here, in this experience, Pirsig backtracks a couple of times on what he says. So for example, he says he doesn't believe in ghosts, and then he says, well, yeah, I do believe in ghosts. And so it's a fascinating chapter to examine and to think about. And to not take at face value, but to ponder pretty extensively, right? And speaking of these mental models, another thing he'll say is that, and this is the way that he presents it. Having written this in the 1970s, he says that to European peoples who have sort of like imbibed the spirit of the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, believing in ghosts in the sense of believing in a spiritual ectoplasm seems like a bit of a stretch, right? But he says if you sort of strip yourself of those mental models, then it becomes much easier if you're in a, for instance, a Native American context or another societal context, it becomes much easier to believe in ghosts. And I think that a lot of what Pirsig is trying to do here is to try to sort of try to discipline the woo, to take all sort of the things that we attribute to woo, whether that's, ghosts or paranormal phenomena, or I don't know, what have you, all these things that are kind of woo, and sort of straighten them out using science, but not in a way that annihilates them. It's actually to straighten them out and sort of structure them and make them rationally intelligible. And it's sort of comparable to the way, it's comparable in the inverse to the way that I think what he's doing in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is he's shoving a crowbar into what we normally think of as scientific and rational and technical thinking. He's trying to shove a crowbar in that and crack it open to allow space for this new sort of disciplined woo. And he's doing it, I think, in, this sort of rigorously scientific way, which is exactly what he does in this chapter, which he says, hey, no, like if we look at science, in the most rigorous way possible, we're going to start running into some weird problems that that make it so that we can't think about science in sort of this simplistic, well, science is right sort of way. Are all Aristotelians closet Platonists? I'm going to have to think about that one. I mean, you kind of want to say yes, right? Because Aristotle is the student of Plato, and Aristotle does copy and paste a lot of what Plato says. I want to, I'm going to have to go tease other Joseph about that because, we've commented that he's much more Aristotelian than I am, and I'm much more Platonist than he is. At least to some degree. Right. And so that would be kind of interesting to think about. I'll have to think about that. I'm actually not sure. Okay, so on a tangent from ghosts, there's another thing that's really important here to talk about, and this is a good time to talk about it. And what it is it's the problem of authorship. It's the problem of understanding who's writing this book and how seriously we should take all of it. And I'm going to get to that eventually, but first I want to talk a little bit about something that we just barely start to get the first hints of in Chapter 3 and in Chapter 4 and in Chapter 5. And that is Pirsig's history of mental health. And it's a strange history. It's an unusual history. It's kind of a baffling history. And even when you know the details, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. It's hard to know what to think about it. And I remember when I was first reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, I really wasn't picking up on any of this. Like when Pirsig started talking about Phaedrus, I was like, who's Phaedrus and what's going on here? This doesn't make any sense. So in these chapters, we begin to learn about an individual named Phaedrus, and Phaedrus is presented as an object of terror. And so who is Phaedrus? Well, roughly speaking, and you need to remember that although this book is substantially correct in its historical details, I can't verify all of the historical details exactly, but the basic outlines of the situation is that Phaedrus is Pirsig's name for who Pirsig was before Pirsig went insane and was submitted by court order to electroshock therapy. And this old personality, Phaedrus, was wiped away and replaced with this new personality, who is the Pirsig who is traveling across the Dakotas with Chris on a motorcycle. So what we actually have here in this book is two different Pirsigs. We have Pirsig, who's riding on a motorcycle across the Dakotas, and then we also have this older Pirsig, who's this totally different personality, who inhabited the same body, but is now, a totally different personality. And the name of that personality is Phaedrus. And of course, Pirsig is terrified of Phaedrus, because Phaedrus, whoever and whatever he is the personality that went insane. Let's sit on that for just one more second and talk about it. So when we talk about personalities, right, I don't think it's a coincidence that this comes up at the same time that Pirsig is talking about ghosts. And the reason why I don't think it's a coincidence is because there's a moment, I haven't figured out which chapter it's in precisely, but it's in one of the first few chapters, where Pirsig, the narrator who's riding across the Dakota, says this: I suppose you could call that a personality. Each machine has its own unique personality, which could probably be defined as the intuitive sum total of everything you know and feel about it. And he says, this changes. It's idiosyncratic to each motorcycle. It's the way each motorcycle sort of settles into its own feel and ride and sound, completely different from, even the same kind of motorcycle that somebody else has been riding in a slightly different way. So these machines, these motorcycles, develop their own idiosyncratic characteristics, this intuitive sum total of everything that you know and feel about the motorcycle. And these idiosyncratic characteristics are, you could call it, the personality of the motorcycle. Right? And so I hope that by now, that doesn't sound like woo. That doesn't sound like some sort of, crazy new agey thing. Ooh, the motorcycle has a personality. The motorcycle is alive. It's not that at all necessarily. What Pirsig is saying is that this personality is the intuitive sum total of everything that we know and feel about the motorcycle. It's sort of a mental framework that we use to approach the underlying phenomena of whatever the motorcycle is. And so fundamentally saying that a motorcycle has a personality is not substantially different from saying that an atom has such and such characteristics. There's some underlying phenomena there. Heaven only knows what that underlying phenomena really is, right? And we're going to describe it using a planetary model or using a plum pudding model or using, this sort of probability shells model or some other new model, right? And so that model is, you could say, it's the personality of the atom. Right? It's sort of the sum total of everything that we've experienced and all the phenomena that we've elicited from whatever this thing is underlying it that we call an atom. Right? And in the same way, a motorcycle can have that same kind of personality. Like, presumably there's some kind of motorcycle underneath there, but it manifests itself in all these myriad ways, and that's what you could call the personality of the motorcycle. And you can actually sort of try to do the same thing to human beings, and if you do that, then you come up with some interesting ideas. And I'm not going to delve into that now, but I'll leave that to you to think about. What happens if you start to think about human personality, or perhaps the human spirit or soul, as the intuitive sum total of all of the patterns of experience that surround that person, whatever that person metaphysically is. And I think this is actually how Pirsig thinks about people. There's some evidence for that in the afterword of the book, but again, I don't think I'm going to get into that right now. But if you read the afterword of the book, you will pick up on that and see how that's working. Okay, so personality. Motorcycles have personalities. Phaedrus is the old personality of Pirsig. Okay, and that makes Phaedrus a ghost. Right? That makes Phaedrus in some sense a ghost. Right? And that creates kind of this fascinating drama because it turns this whole book into a ghost story. And there's this phenomenal, I believe it's in chapter 6. It's when they go camping, I believe. Okay, so it's in chapter 5. Okay, so I'm covering a little bit of chapters 3, 4, and 5 today. Right, so when you get to chapter 5, they go camping. And Chris, and you'll also notice, right, Pirsig's not the only one who has to worry about his mental health. Something is wrong with Chris, too. And, I just want you to sort of put that in the back of your mind. We're going to address it more later as we go through the book. But I just want to put that in the back of your mind right now, that Chris has some potential mental health issues, and that Pirsig is also worried about his mental health for some fairly valid reasons, let's say. Right? Anyway, so they go camping, and Pirsig mentions this poem, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this poem. It's been set to piano by, I think, Franz Schubert, and I played it for somebody, for another student in high school. This other student had quite a good singing voice, and he sang this poem that I'm about to tell you about, and I played the piano, and I mentioned that because the piano piece is quite dynamic and interesting and fun. It's a great piece to listen to, and I apologize for all the ways that I'm going to massacre the pronunciation now, but it's Der Erlkönig. It's German. It's the Elf King is what it translates to, is the translation that I see the most. And this comes up. And so if you don't know about this poem, I recommend you go read it and listen to the Franz Schubert. I think it's Franz Schubert who writes the piano music for it. It's a phenomenal little piece, and there's even a really cool video on YouTube that has it sort of animated. It's really great to look up. But so Der Erlkönig, the Elf King, is this poem about a father who is riding home late at night with his son behind him on a horse. And the son is sick, and he's trying to get the son home so that he can be healed, so that he can receive some medical attention. And as they ride, the boy says, "Father, don't you see the Elf King? He's coming up behind us." And the son says, that there's certain things that the Elf King is doing, that he's reaching out to him with his fingers to grab him, that the Elf King is speaking to him, and in each case, The father says, well, no, there's no elf king, right? There's no Earl Koenig here. There's no supernatural phenomena going on at all. There's nothing woo. You know, when you heard the voice of the elf king, that was just the wind sighing through the branches. And when you felt the elf king clutching at you to pull you away from the horse, that's not the elf king. That's, you know, it's a perfectly natural phenomenon. It's just the branches grabbing at you as we ride through the woods. And by the time you get to the end of the story, spoiler alert, by the time you get to the end of the story, they arrive at the farmhouse, and it actually turns out that the boy is dead. And so this poem is deliberately ambiguous about whether or not the elf king is real. Because the boy sees the elf king, the boy experiences that, and the boy dies. But from the father's perspective, it's just, you know, he's trying to get his son to safety, and there is no elf king. It's just purely natural phenomena. And it's just purely natural phenomena. And the reason why the boy dies at the end is, you know, because of his illness. And it's not the elf king. Right. And so the poem itself is ambiguous about this. And what I want to point out is that, and, you know, this is what Pirsig says in the book, is that he's in the same situation riding on a motorcycle with his son Chris behind him instead of, you know, riding on a horse instead of a German father riding on his horse with his son behind him. And so it's quite this, you know, remarkable parallel. It's actually really cool, I think. But Chris's mental illness, or his mental illness situation, whatever is going on there, is linked to whoever and whatever this old personality Phaedrus was. And Pirsig, the narrator, is also linked to whoever and whatever Phaedrus is. Because and this starts to happen in these chapters and continues throughout the book, Phaedrus begins to surface again, right? He begins to come out. You know, the first place that it happens is that Pirsig recognizes this stretch of road, and he's like, where have I been here? How can I recognize this stretch of road? I don't think I've ever been here before. And he realizes it's Phaedrus. It's this old personality that was destroyed by electroshock therapy. It's this old personality that was here and recognizes it and knows where the motel is, even though Phaedrus, the narrator, you know, has no memory of this place and doesn't know anything about this city or this road. So I mentioned that for two reasons. One is so that you can keep your eye on that as you move through the story. Especially because notice that Pirsig is going to aim directly at the death force underlying technology. Remember, he's going to aim directly at that death force and try to understand it, to try to heal it. And by doing so, at every moment, he's going to be moving closer to this old fearsome personality that he's running away from, called Phaedrus, right? And so every step that he takes closer towards this goal of understanding the technological death force and presumably illuminating and teaching all of us, every step he takes towards that goal is also a step towards this terrible precipice of insanity. And it is a terrible precipice, and he knows it's a terrible precipice because it happened to him. And there were consequences for him because of that. So that's one reason why you need to know this, is because it's actually related to everything that he's trying to unpack and understand and analyze over the course of this book. There's a second reason why it's important to understand sort of this old personality Phaedrus and this new personality Pirsig, who's riding across the Dakotas on a motorcycle. The reason why you need to understand this is because it helps us understand ever so much better the authorship of the book. It's a very, very, very complex book. And this is one of the ways that the book is so complex, is that there's at least 3 different versions of Pirsig in the book, right? So first of all, we have Phaedrus, who's this pre-electroshock personality, right? And we also have Pirsig, the narrator, who's riding across the Dakotas on a motorcycle. But I believe, and I think you can build a perfectly reasonable case about this, I think it's, you know, pretty obvious actually, that there is a third Pirsig, and that is Pirsig the author, who is later writing this book, you know, something like a decade or 6 years or 5 years, something like that, after the events that occur in the book, after this motorcycle trek. And by the way, somebody's mentioned in the comments that the son is held fast in the father's arm, not riding behind. I thank you. I actually don't recall the precise details of the poem, so certainly could be, and I'll assume that you're correct. The parallel is still quite striking, right? Father and son riding together on something, you know, and part of why Pirsig is riding on this motorcycle, why he took Chris, is to try to help his mental health situation. And so there is really quite a striking parallel there, I think. Okay, so where was I? So we've got Pirsig, and we've got three different Pirsigs, right? We've got Phaedrus, Pirsig the narrator, and Pirsig the author. And this is important because they're all different, and they all have different opinions. And so when Pirsig, the narrator, says, well, you can't trust Phaedrus, right? He was... See? Okay, it appears the snowball mic is back. So thank you. I'm going to back up a second, right? So the point is that these three different Pirsigs, thank you, everybody. These three Pirsigs have different opinions about each other. And so it's not at all clear who you should listen to or who's correct. Okay, yeah, so you can't trust Phaedrus, right? So Pirsig, the narrator, who's on the motorcycle, thinks you can't trust Phaedrus. But does Pirsig, the author, have the same opinion? Or does he think that Phaedrus is okay? Or maybe he thinks that Phaedrus is partially the bad guy and partially the good guy. And if so, then like where precisely is that boundary between good Phaedrus and bad Phaedrus? And for that matter, what about Pirsig, who's riding the motorcycle across the Dakotas? Is there a good Pirsig and a bad Pirsig? And I think you can definitely make a case that there is. That there's moments where Pirsig is an absolute coward, and that he's a jerk to his son Chris. He's not a good father at all. But there might also be cases where Pirsig, the narrator, who's riding the motorcycle across the country, is the good guy, and he's trying to accomplish something good, and that he's actually clearing up what Phaedrus said, and, giving us this improved view of it, this improved understanding of it that won't lead us into insanity. And then, of course, there's whether or not you can trust Phaedrus and Pirsig, the narrator, the degree to which you can trust them, that's totally up in the air. It's totally up in the air how much Pirsig, the author, wants us to trust either of these two characters, right? And for that matter, you don't have to trust necessarily what Pirsig, the author, says either. But the point is, it's actually quite difficult to figure out what Pirsig, the author, is trying to say, because it's very ambiguous what the characters in his story. It's very ambiguous the way we should interpret them or the way we should understand them. And that's part of what makes this book so complex. And so sometimes I'll hear people say, oh, the father was such a jerk to the son, right? That's unforgivable. It wasn't a very good book. And I want to say, well, wait a second here, back up. If you understand that there's three different Pirsigs going on here, there's three different Pirsigs in the story, if you understand that, you can say, well, yes, we understand that. And we know that Pirsig is a jerk to his son. And that's the point, is that Pirsig, in some ways, Pirsig, the narrator, in some ways is a very inadequate individual. And he's even a very faulty individual. First and foremost, that he's a coward, and that cowardice results in, terrible and disastrous consequences for his son. And that by the end of the book, that's what we're supposed to understand. And we're supposed to understand perhaps something along the lines of that Pirsig, the narrator, and Phaedrus, this old personality, need to become reintegrated in some way, right? That Pirsig, the narrator, is in some sense the bad guy, and that's the way it's supposed to be. That's what we're supposed to understand from the book. So it's not a critique on the book, it's a compliment of the book. And all of that you can understand if you understand the sort of, there's three different Pirsigs here, and you need to keep your eye on that. And this also raises another point that I've addressed briefly, and then I'm going to address briefly once more, is that this book is very much like a koan, right? And a Zen koan is it's a Zen teaching device, and it's typically some sort of story or riddle or saying that is ridiculous on its face or confusing or otherwise opaque to the understanding. It's not something that you can just sort of take at face value and understand intuitively and immediately. So, for example, one of my favorite koans is that if you meet the Buddha, you should kill him. And of course, that's a very strange thing for a Buddhist monk to say, right? Well, supposedly you venerate the Buddha, and so if you meet the Buddha, you shouldn't kill him. You don't kill the things you venerate. And at least one interpretation of this koan is that if you ever meet the Buddha, you haven't really met the Buddha, because nobody can actually embody the Buddha 100% perfectly. And so if you think you've met the Buddha, then actually what's happened is you've sort of created this false image, this idol of what the Buddha is, and you're projecting it onto this other person. And so you need to, perhaps not literally kill the person, but kill your image or your concept of who and what the Buddha is, and sort of, allow your concept to modify and develop, kind of like your idea of gravity or your idea of whatever an atom is, right? And so these Zen koans, right, are these statements that appear ridiculous, confusing, or opaque on their surface, but if pondered, yield enlightenment. They yield greater and deeper knowledge. And that, in my mind, that's the correct way to approach Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, and that this approach is reflected in sort of this three-author structure, and why it's all so confusing. Is because you're not supposed to take the things he says here at face value, because it's not even clear what the face value of any of it is. Instead, it's something that you need to ponder, you need to chew on, and that pondering, and going back to our cow metaphor from the last lecture / discussion, going back to our cow metaphor, if you will chew the cud on this, that's what will actually produce enlightenment. So it's not necessarily so much about, and I think Pirsig would really agree with this, not least because, although Pirsig is trying to teach us ideas in this book, the number one thing that he's trying to do is to help us lead quality lives. And he says as much. He says, if metaphysics makes your life better, then hooray for metaphysics. And if not, then forget it. Although I have to parenthetically note that it's Pirsig, the narrator, who says that. And so, maybe you want to build a case that Pirsig, the narrator, is wrong about that. But let's at least take that at face value momentarily. So it's a very confusing book. And understanding that there's 3 different Pirsigs here will help, if it doesn't make it less confusing, it will at least give you a way to sort of navigate the confusion. All right. Okay, I'm not sure if that's everything that I had prepared for today. Let me review real briefly. And also, this is a great time for comments in the chat if there are any, or questions for me to tackle. We've talked about ghosts. We've talked about whether or not the law of gravity is real, and what ways it might be real and what ways it might not be real, and why that's a perfectly valid scientific critique that doesn't have to owe anything to sort of New Age fruitcakey philosophies. Instead, it's a very hard-headed scientific critique, which is exactly what you'd expect from Pirsig, as we are about to learn. He has some pretty good scientific credentials. Kevin says, I'm just jealous because the voices in Phaedrus' head won't talk. You don't know that, Kevin. You don't know that. But more seriously, this is where it starts to sound a little bit like woo, right? Is that, we need to sort of, as you read this book, if you're reading it properly, you need to sort of channel your inner Phaedrus and channel your inner Pirsig the narrator and channel your inner Pirsig the author and try to sort through all this. And that's not particularly easy. And perhaps it does require some, sort of an intuitive touch, perhaps. Let's see. So we've talked about gravity. We've talked about why that's a hard-headed scientific critique. We've also talked quite a bit about Phaedrus' sanity and about the fact that there are 3. Talked a bit about Pirsig, how there's 3 Pirsigs and how that matters, and about why that matters, and about how that helps you understand the book better. And we talked about also the fact that every time that Pirsig, as he tries to unravel this problem, as he tries to help us understand the death force that undergirds technology, and remember last time we learned it's not just a death force that undergirds technology, it's a death force that potentially undergirds all systems of all kinds, including your employment, schools, the government, corporations, blah, 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 all of it, right? That's what Pirsig is tackling here, is the death force that potentially inhabits all of those phenomena, right? All of those systems. As Pirsig the narrator moves closer and closer towards solving that problem, he also moves closer and closer to his own insanity. Let's see. Okay, wow. Well, we've done such a good job, everyone. Let's all pat ourselves on the back because we've made it through 2 chapters, which I was not necessarily sure if we would do it. The last thing I want to comment is, again, bringing it back to Pirsig's whole quest here. This quest to find that death force and understand it and analyze it and understand it in such a way that it lets us properly heal those systems and properly interact with those systems. And, excuse me, I'm sorry, there was one more thing, if you'll allow me just one moment to collect my thoughts. Okay, well, I think with the connection to systems, that's probably... Oh dear, it says that the image is frozen. Say it ain't so. Okay, well, I think, it's just as well. We're just right about at the end, and what I'll close on is by mentioning that this is still all prelude. We are 4 chapters in, guys, 4.5 chapters in, and that we're going to get quite a bit deeper on these ideas and see where they lead us. It's going to be wonderfully exciting. So I want to thank you all for those of you who are watching live, and also those of you who may watch or listen to this in the future. I can't wait to hear your comments about this and your questions so that we can continue to go deeper into this. Again, all of this is prelude to all of the really good stuff that's coming on later. It's necessary prelude. It's important prelude. But as far as I'm concerned, Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance just gets better from here. So once again, thank you very much, and I hope you're all doing well and that you're safe. And I look forward to seeing some or most or